I automatically have it automatically recording, or if we have to click that?
You have it automatically recording.
This is a good breathe and center moment, isn't it, everyone?
Yeah. Deep breath.
We are social workers, right?
We are social workers.
I see we're live on YouTube and we're broadcasting to all attendees. And we're recording.
Welcome everyone. Welcome everyone. We're going to give folks just about another minute or so to join us, and then we are going to get started. Again, welcome everyone. We are still having folks join us, and so we're going to give folks about another 30 seconds or so to join, and then we will get started. Again, welcome everyone. We are still having folks join us, and so we're going to give folks about another 30 seconds or so to join.
That's the YouTube we hear?
And get started. Okay, thank you. Good evening. Let me take this opportunity to welcome you to this webinar, which is sponsored by the UNC School of Social Work Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and the Jordan Institute for Families. My name is Travis Albritton, and I am the Assistant Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the UNC School of Social Work. And we're happy that you're joining us this evening for our third installment of our webinar series entitled In Conversation, Recognizing and Disrupting Systematic Racism in Social Work Practice. As we think about the numerous events that we have seen happen over the last several months in this country regarding race and regarding social injustice, we recognize that as social workers, we have a responsibility to respond in ways that will help uplift our communities and support the calls for justice and action that so many across this country have protested for. We must also deal with the very real reality, however, that in some ways, social work perpetuates some of the very real social injustices and racist practices that are so common in our society. Our webinar this evening is designed to tackle those questions and to consider how social work practitioners should disrupt and respond to racism in practice. I'm happy to be joined this evening by an esteemed panel that I will now introduce. First, we have Derek Anderson, Executive Director, Race Matters for Juvenile Justice. Alan Detlef, Dean of the University of Houston Graduate College of School of Social Work. and lead for the Up-In movement. Jackie Jinks, Executive Director, Interfaith Council. Bonita Joyce, a local school social worker. Leah Kaz, Restorative Practices Associate for the Dispute Settlement Center. And Rebecca Swafford, Prevention Coordinator, North Carolina Coalition Against Domestic Violence. I'm also happy to be joined this evening by my co-moderator, Dr. Allison DeMarco, who is going to begin our discussion. And the way that the discussion is going to work today is we are going to alternate asking our panelists a list of questions that we have already prepared as it relates to disrupting racism in social work practice. For those of you joining us via webinar or YouTube, if you would like to ask a question, we ask that you would post your question in the question and answer section located at the bottom of your screen. And we will leave time at the end of this webinar to entertain any questions that you might have. At this time, I would like to turn this portion of our program over to Dr. Allison DeMarco, who will lead us further.
Thank you so much, Travis, and thank you all so much for being here and for accepting our call to come talk with us today. We're really excited just to kind of do this round robin informal style with you, just to get a lot of ideas out there to share with our participants. So I'm going to ask the first question, and our first question is directed to Jackie and Rebecca. So Jackie, if you don't mind going first, that would be great. So our first question is, how do you educate colleagues and coworkers about racist behaviors, policies, and actions in your agency that they perpetuate on a regular basis? And if you can too, how does this look different for white folks versus Black folks and other folks of color?
Thank you. Thanks for having me. So I think the first thing that's been important here at IFC is that we recognize that most racist behaviors are not intentional or overt, and that they might be showing up in our work as microaggressions or as institutional policies or practices that are harmful. So some of the things that we have done on the very basic level is looking at our mission and vision and values, and also how we operationalize those, and making sure that we are taking into consideration those things. We've moved at IFC from a charity model to a social justice model. We're still growing and learning what that looks like and what that means. And we have formed, about 3 years ago, we formed a racial equity team called the Real Transformation Team, and Real stands for Race, Equity, Action, and Leadership. And that's comprised of board members, staff, volunteers, and members and residents here at IFC. And that team's really been working through a lot of doing an equity assessment, looking at how we operationalize our mission, vision, and values, and what kinds of things that we need to really dig in on, as well as providing training and support to all of those stakeholder groups that I mentioned.
Thanks, Jackie. Rebecca, how would you respond?
Yeah, so at our organization, we, over the past few years, have been going through an internal equity process that's specifically focusing on racial equity. And in this initial part of the process, we worked a lot with external equity consultants who did a lot of training with us and gathered a lot of data through interviews with us, through surveys with us, to really get a sense of where were folks at, what were the experiences of folks that were happening at the agency, and specifically what were the experiences of folks who were white and had white privilege versus those who were people of color and may have been experiencing racism and white supremacy within our organization, to really uncover what exactly was happening. So in my agency, with my colleagues who I work with on a day-to-day basis, I have sort of the added benefit of the buy-in to this process. And there's a lot of mutual education that happens through that process. We've gotten really used to having really open conversations about what's happening, and have started to get a lot more comfortable with conflict. And we're certainly by no means perfect for those things, but we've definitely made progress in that way. And we also have race-based caucusing happening within our organization, which provides a specific space where, like, I as a white person can be held accountable by other white people, and I can hold other white people accountable in the work that we need to be doing to disrupt and unlearn racism in our own behaviors, and to be questioning the policies and practices that we're doing within our organization as well. And then recently, I had the opportunity to be able to do some of this education and advocacy with my funder. So I am funded by a very large federal agency, and I was able to be part of an organizing effort with other folks who were receiving the same grant as me across the country, to then be able to make anti-racism a key portion of our reverse site visit with our funder, and was able to use tools like Tema Oken's White Supremacy Culture article that talks about the different factors of white supremacy and how that shows up within organizations, as a way to sort of start some conversation about how do we look at how white supremacy is showing up in our own grant program, and how does it show up within our own organizations and within our own behaviors, so that we can really start to dismantle how that's happening.
Thank you both. I just want to follow up with one thing that Jackie stated earlier. Jackie, you said that your agency, that you all are moving from a charity model to more of a social justice equity model. And for those who might not understand what that is, I wonder if you could just take a moment and speak to the move from charity to social justice, and specifically, why is that so important as you think about educating folks as it relates to racist behaviors, policies, and actions that might be a part of your agency?
Sure. So in a charity model, it's very prevalent, and I think for IFC was founded by groups of volunteers and was volunteer run for 30 years. It was founded by, it's called Interfaith Council because it was founded by congregations here in Chapel Hill and Carrboro who came together and who are still very much a part of the organization now. And we have a lot of volunteers who come and give out food at the food pantry, or work at the shelter, or help prepare meals, etc. And I think the charity model really being, I'm here to provide services for you because you need them. And sometimes the sort of underlying, I think thought or assumption is that people sort of did something to get to the place where they were, or made a mistake. And we as a society tend to blame people for poverty, for homelessness, for food insecurity. And so really, moving to a social justice model where we say we recognize that there are inequities in the system, and that the country was built on systems that disadvantage people of color, particularly Black and brown folks, and we know that we need to correct that, but that doesn't mean that people did something to get to this place. And so recognizing that as the premise of what we're doing, and then saying we not only need to still provide shelter, provide food for folks, but we also need to work, to change the systems and disrupt the systems so that we don't have to be here providing the food and the shelter 60 more years from now. So I think that's really where we've come. And I will say that we spend a lot of time, we call our operationalizing, that I keep saying, of our mission and vision and our social justice approach is called Our Approach. We spent over a year debating the bullet points of our approach, specifically the one that says systems are, or that people, the poverty and other societal issues are caused by by unjust systems, and that people really had to work through that to be able to put that in writing and say that we were going to, write that and live that out. I hope I answered your question.
Very much so. Thank you for that.
Okay.
I think it's important as we have this conversation that we think about system change and the way the entire system needs to be changed, as opposed to just working with individual people at a personal level. So no, that was quite helpful. I'm going to move us now to our next question, and we're going to direct this question primarily to Leah and to Dean Detlef. But I would ask that before you answer, if you could just remind our audience the type of agency that you are currently working in, so that they can have some context for your answer. And so the question that I want to pose to both Dean Detlef and Leah is, could you tell us how you respond to colleagues or coworkers who are resistant to acknowledging the racism that exists within your institution or organization, or within their own practice? Obviously, we are having a lot of conversations now about racism and about anti-racist practice, and there are some who continue to be resistant or don't or feel that if you point things out to them that you're calling them a racist. And I'm just curious about how you address that resistance when you're working with folks. And Leah, we'll start with you.
Hi, thank you all for having me. So again, my name is Leah Kaz, and I work at a very small nonprofit based in Carborough. I'm at the Dispute Settlement Center, which is a mediation center, the first mediation center in North Carolina. And in response to this question, I can honestly say I'll be speaking about many work experiences I have, not just specifically at the organization I work at now. When I'm met with resistance in bringing up racism in our field, in our practice, in the systems in which we operate, that's how I know I'm in the right place to continue a conversation. When there's resistance, there's something there, whether it's shame, guilt, a need to better understand the client's worlds and our own worlds. So I think resistance, my initial learning over my life has been, when I'm met with resistance, to slow down and adopt some kind of spirit of inquiry, some kind of question. Maybe, where is this coming from, right? Because I think that the more I can understand and discern where that resistance is coming from, the more accurately I can work with how to tease that apart with a colleague, a coworker. I would say once I have some kind of assurance that I'm in the right place to keep doing this, have some kind of curiosity, I also focus on the relationship I have with the other person. Is this someone who I already have a familiar working relationship? I know their communication style, I know their conflict style, or do I need to learn about that, right? Because I want to speak in a way that has integrity for the work of focusing on our racist world, and also integrity for the relationship and making sure that they can really hear me. Because I've come to believe that if I'm not speaking in a way that my colleagues can hear me when I'm addressing them, that resistance can get thicker in my personal experience. So I focus on the relationship. What do I know about this person? I also see if there's any way that I can learn alongside them. So if there's some kind of shared values we hold, either organizational values, professional, personal values, social work ethics, can I say, I'm really interested in what was tricky from our last conversation, and I think we could both learn more, and we could both and try to accompany that person. So out of respect for time, I would say that's kind of my entree into how I begin when I met with resistance. Thanks.
Thank you, Leah. Dean Detlef, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. Well, I think, when you asked the question first, Travis, you acknowledged that because of the tragedies of this summer, I think a lot of people are somewhat more open to engaging in thinking about this, how racism exists in our institutions. So that's been helpful. But I think for me, and as a reminder, I work in a College of Social Work, so an institution for higher education. I think one of the things that I've found helpful is Dr. Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, I found has been a really good entry point into having those conversations, because the focus of that book is about systems and how policies within systems produce and maintain racial inequities. So it doesn't minimize individual racist actions, but it really focuses on the systemic institutional structures that create racial inequities. For me, I work in an institution for higher education. So, and acknowledging that institutions of higher education were created by white people for the benefit of white people, and then the policies that are inherent in those institutions, particularly as they relate to things like tenure and promotion, which then impacts whose voices are valued more, those who are promoted, those who have tenure. All of those things are impacted by the racist origins of the system that we all work in. And I think Dr. Kendi's book is really helpful in understanding that. So a way for us to start talking about that was I provided copies of the book for all of our faculty and staff, and then we started a book club where we started to have conversations about the concepts of the book, how does that apply to us? And so that was a really helpful exercise for us to start with. The other thing that I've tried to do is just really encourage people to listen and to value the lived experiences of other people. What I've seen happen is that when people of color share their experiences about racism, white people tend to get defensive and question people of color's experiences and say, well, are you sure it was racism? Are you sure it wasn't this other thing? That happened to me too, but it was kind of different. And really just encourage people to listen. And when people of color share their experiences of racism, believe them. Don't question it, believe them, and look for what you can learn from that. And if I can get people to a place where they can do that, just listen, believe people, and think about what you can learn from it. That's what I think we all need to be doing to move further along in this journey.
Thank you both so much. And as we move to our next question, because this is twice that this has come up, I just want to point out to folks that in my follow-up question to Jackie and in Dean Detlef's answer, we both got to the place of talking about systems, right? And I think it's important for us to understand that these systems are doing exactly what they are designed to do, right? They are benefiting exactly the folks that they are designed to benefit. And so helping folks understand how they fit within that system and how they oftentimes help perpetuate the systems of racism, I think is a really important point to point out here. And it's something that, at least in the first two questions, continues to just come up for us. And I think for our audience, I just, again, want to drive that point home for folks. I'm going to turn it over to Allison for our next question.
Thanks, Travis. And our school read Dr. Kendi's book last year. So that was very enriching and engaging for us too. So I appreciate that you shared that. So my next question is for Benita and then for Derek. So from your perspective, what does it mean to disrupt racism? What are strategies for embedding practices that disrupt whiteness and racism within an organization? So Benita, thank you.
Thank you all for having me. So I think that I would like to start out by making it clear that I am representing one of those systems that was built on racism. So being in a school, we have a completely different relationship with our community than most of you do. We have a mandatory 12-year relationship that whether you like it or not, you have to be there. We have policies and practices and procedures that are set in place with a power structure system to them. We have histories, the lived experiences that are often not valued. We have different perspectives, and those things show up in the outcomes and the data that contribute to all of our gaps that we have in society. And I think that one thing that we really need to do It's work on understanding and acknowledging the root cause of the issues that we're having and how they are contributing to our social ills. It's difficult to talk about race. It is difficult to be in spaces with people that you feel are being treated unfairly or are acting in a way that doesn't seem just and fair. But when I look at school social work, I don't feel that our job description is even in alignment with our code of ethics. So then it makes it difficult when the expectation is to maybe connect resources or build programs, and that's not in alignment with addressing racial injustice. It's not always in alignment with what actually needs to happen. And so a lot of times we are day to day doing things that are also keeping people oppressed and acting in a charity model and not necessarily addressing the system. And so some things that could occur is for us to even understand the history of the students that we are working with, understand the histories of the families. So the lived experience is real, but if we only rely on book knowledge, then we come across with the, are you sure that that is what happened to you? We need to figure out a way to have a conversation where we are addressing our system and not continuing to provide programs and interventions, just the outcomes look really different, and not figuring out a way to rely on data, but also looking at the culture and climate of our system, because that also plays a really, really big part in everything that goes on and the outcomes that we are getting right now. And until we figure out how to use data in a way that's not just superficial and is not just leading to a different program or a different, anger management strategy or whatever it is, we're going to continue to have the same issues.
Thanks so much, Benita. Derek?
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Benita hit a lot of great points. So I don't know what's left to say, but I would agree. In addition to that, again, Derek Anderson with Race Matters for Juvenile Justice, and part of the work that I am a system organizer, which means I work at a macro level. And as system organizer, our primary focus is really looking at and talking about institutional racism, white supremacy as the root cause of what's happening within systems and institutions. And our primary focus is really looking at the structure and equities that's embedded within policy, procedures, and practices that's causing disparity and disproportionality across all systems. And we do it through a racial equity lens. One of the things about our work is that we speak the language, and because one thing that we recognize is that institutional racism thrives when it's invisible. And the other power that we recognize is language. And so in our work, we really believe in language, terms, and definitions. And so if we really were to ask and survey everyone that's on this call, what is your definition of race? What is your definition of racism? What is your definition of white supremacy? What is your definition of institutional racism? We each will have a different definition based on our socialization and our lived experiences. What we have recognized is that people still think that race and racism is not a problem. So until we first acknowledge it's a problem, only can we address it. The second thing is that sometimes people try to explain it away, as some of you all talked about. And because we recognize it rests within systems and institutions, even within structures, as people, based on our socialization, based on our lived experiences, based on our values and beliefs and our action and behaviors, it shows up with us personal inside our systems and institutions. And what I find sometimes is that even though policies and procedures need to be changed, sometimes people really don't have the heart and mind to do so because of their values and beliefs. And I say it's an intellectual exercise. It's an intellectual exercise that sometimes we say the right things, but we really don't mean it. If we pay attention to what's going on today and the things that's been said about people and put out on social media, and then people come back and apologize for what they said. And so as a part of this work, one of the things I understand is about building rapport, is about building trust. And it's about building relationships. This work is around relationships, about the heart and mind. And inside of that, you also have to have people who are connected to want to do the right thing. And one of the things we talk about sometimes is that even though you may be, you say you for the cause, but you can also be a hindrance because your inaction is really an action, right? And I think it starts with us. One of the things I talk about is, for me, how do I shift my mental model? What are my blind spots? What are my actions and behaviors? And how to begin to identify what those are as we talk about when we move forward. Because when we look at our implicit bias and our blind spots and how it shows up in the decision, the data shows it, regardless of our race and gender. And once you disaggregate your data by race and gender, it tells a story. But the question is, do we then look through a racial equity lens, look at our policy, procedure, and practice, and then begin to provide those institutional resources based on those racial groups that have been mostly impacted? And if not, why not? And so when we talk about shifting resources, right, then we come up with a question and we explain why we can and why we cannot do it. And we can't always assume that everybody is with us, even they look like us. And so as a part of this journey, I believe each of us have a responsibility to do our part. And even when we talk about in the field of social work, I think we have to be truth tellers no matter what system or institution you're in. You have to tell the truth about the history of the system that and the harm that it's caused. I don't believe we can really have reconciliation if we can't have truth telling. If we think about relationships and personal relationships, it's how many have been in a relationship where one party wanted to move on, but the other party was still stuck and hurt and harmed. So if we look at that within our systems and institutions with people of color who have been marginalized and oppressed for years, then and now, not just the consumers, but also faculty and staff inside that system. But it's not until you understand the story and lived experiences of people of color that we begin to give voice. And more importantly, we have to share power. We have to look at how we intentionally share and empower people of color and those who are marginalized and oppressed, and how do we bring their voice and their perspective to the table as we co-design and redeconstruct these systems. We have to co-design and co-create with people who haven't had power. But that means people who have power have to be willing to give it up. And that becomes at a personal choice, right? Without setting the agenda and then bringing people to the table, sometimes it's important to bring people to the table and then allow the different perspectives of different backgrounds and stories and lived experiences to co-design what it means to move forward. And so I think those are just some of the practical things that can happen. And I think it starts with us. It starts with us having a racial equity lens. So that means we need to have a level set on terms, language, and definition inside our systems that we can agree to. We have to then disaggregate our data by race and gender or by geographic or zip code, and then begin to say, what is the story and lived experience behind the data? And then how do we engage those who've been mostly impacted by the data to allow their voice and lived experience to show up? And then we have to put practical measures in place to look at addressing the policy, procedures, and practices. And there has to be a system of accountability and a system of feedback. And so once we incorporate a system of feedback and system of accountability, it allows that system to continue to update with new world information, real world problems, and real world solutions to address the problem that's on the table.
Thank you so much. That was a very powerful response, and I think naturally leads us into our next question. Dr. Ibram Kendi, and you've already heard his name mentioned in this webinar, but Dr. Kendi argues that the only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. And so my question, and I want to pose this question to Dean Detlef and go back to Derek here. What does anti-racist practice look like in the context of your work? And I want to acknowledge that I think, Derek, you've already started to answer this question a little bit just by the whole notion of sharing resources, sharing power, the importance of accountability, as well as the co-creation of interventions and knowledge and ideas that are really going to work to address some of the problems that folk are facing. But I want to start with you and give you the opportunity to add a little bit more to that if you would like, and then we will go to Dean Detlef.
Sure, thank you. I'll go back to, again, even when we talk about the author and the statement that's being made and strategies to address that, we have to, there are still people out there, even within our systems institution, who don't think it's a problem. And until there's a reckoning where everyone identifies and sees the problem the same, we can't address it. The second thing, as it relates to language, for some reason, there are people who are stuck on the language that if I am considered a racist, what does that mean to some people, right? And so as we began to think about that and began to think about how that lands on people, and one of the things as we move and look at that, when we talk about what it means to have anti-racist practice, and what does that look like? The first thing I would say, it starts with you. It starts with me. It starts with me becoming educated about the history of our country, the history of the United States, the history of policies and laws that continue to cause disparity and disproportionality. One of the things I think is a failure when having these conversations around race and racism is that we don't have a true understanding around the history of this country to see how systemically over time people of color have been impacted. And so often people talk about slavery. Yes. But when we talk about slavery, you don't hear much when it talks about after that, lynching, the area of lynching. Why is that we don't talk much about that? When it's been documented during that period of time of post-Reconstruction, over 4,000 Black men, women, and children were lynched and killed by mobs of white men. Were they held accountable by our judicial justice system? If not, our justice system, if not, why not? And then we talk about, even during slavery and those things, we talk about slave patrol and modern day policing and the laws and policies. If we don't understand then Black codes, right? And then convict leasing, mass incarceration, how all these patterns have continued to impact Black men and families for centuries and still. So when we talk about the issues and problems we have today in our education system, or what we're seeing playing out on TV and the protests, we can't just look at that situation in isolation. We have to understand the history about how the Black community have been under siege by institutions then and now. And so first understanding that, and then being able to say, how do we now be able to share power? How do we now co-design and co-create? And how do we heal as part of that process? But we had to acknowledge. And even today, there are systems who won't even acknowledge the atrocities they have caused. If you disaggregate your data by race and gender, whether it's a local level, state level, national level, what you're going to find out is that white have the best outcomes and people of color have the worst outcomes. But we will blame those actions and behaviors on people of color, whether in the education system, whether in the healthcare system, whether it's higher education or whatever it is. And so I think as a part of that process, we all have to get in alignment. We all have to have a shared learning. We all have to develop shared language, and we all have to be intentional to center equity and be intentional about interrupting systems and structures.
Thank you. Dean Detlef.
Thanks. Yeah, that was really, a lot of that was a really great answer. I'll just give a specific example of something that we've done in my college. I think the concept of anti-racist discrimination is a really important concept related to this work. And we really started to, or that concept has really influenced how we think about hiring in our program, because ensuring that you have diverse voices at the table is a really important part of this work. And I didn't have the language anti-racist discrimination when we started doing this, but when I started as dean in 2015, so 5 years ago, I realized that we had a very diverse student body, but not a very diverse faculty. Which was problematic, and this is the case in a lot of places. And I talked with our search committee to get their thoughts about, why that was, how they go about hiring, what their process or practices have been. And I realized that the way they were going about hiring is looking at people's CVs or resumes, counting up publications that people had, counting up grant money that people brought in with them, looking a lot at where people went for their PhD program and looking at valuing schools like UNC and Columbia and WashU over other schools. And the result was that we had hired white person after white person after white person after white person. And I think that happens because when you only look at those objective criteria, where you're able to get your PhD is dependent in a lot of ways on where you go to kindergarten, the kind of community that you grow up in, and where the schooling that you're able to get after that, the mentorship that you get throughout your life. So we started to change that and really value lived experiences as a person of color as an important qualifying factor to have a job on our faculty. Because our faculty, we can teach people how to write a grant, how to write for publication, how to teach. We can't teach a white person what it's like to experience racism in this country. And we wanted that experience on our faculty. So we now privilege the experience that people of color bring with them because of their experiences of understanding and living with racism in this country. And we privilege that over some other factors like number of publications, where you got your degree, things like that. So to me, that's what the concept of anti-racist discrimination is about. We're hoping to move that idea about valuing and privileging people's experiences as people of color into the way we think about admissions into our program with students. We're trying to eliminate objective measures. We eliminated the GRE several years ago. This year, we hope to eliminate GPA as a requirement because it's biased. And then as we eliminate these more objective things, valuing these other experiences that people bring with them, that they bring to the table with them. So that's the way it's manifested a bit in my organization.
And can I just add one thing?
Sure.
Even when we're talking about connecting lived experience and then understanding history, if you think about now in our school systems, how we are trying to get law enforcement out of our schools, when you continue to undervalue or overlook the lived experience of students of color in our school system, and then you do not have a history and knowledge and understanding of slave patrol, lynching, all of the laws that are still in place that are used to control Black body, Black thought, then you have a space where you still have people advocating to have law enforcement in our schools, not even considering the impact that with all the social unrest that's happening right now, on top of the continued advocacy for changing the culture and environment in our school systems for some of our students. That's where that disconnect, that's like a great example of where that disconnect begins. But you're still going to ask students to come to a space. And even if you don't understand that history, people of color, their parents, their grandparents have stories about the history of how their families interact with law enforcement. So I just wanted to connect those two pieces to just give an example of what it looks like now in day-to-day practice in our systems.
And just one quick thought, and I'm going to move. We also think about the concept of transactional versus transformational. If we see what's happening, what's going on when these protests, you had a lot of companies and corporations and businesses putting out public statements that they support or in line with Black Lives Matter or any other initiative. And so I don't know the heart and mind of that intent, right, of that system and institution. But the question is, what happens thereafter? Where is there a system or action plan or accountability or a plan of action to do something? And so when we talk about intent versus impact, and so the other side of that, transformative is really alternate ways and looking at shifting how you do institutional practices or focus on policy and organizational culture. And what is the accountability to that? Are you being accountable to communities of color? Are you looking at shifting your hiring practice, your interview team? Are you looking at all those structural processes? And then who are you bringing to the table? When you disaggregate your data in terms of their leadership from the board all the way down, what does that look like? And so when we think about it, moving from transactional to really transformational, and then having a feedback system, a system of accountability, so that the system can be accountable to someone other than themselves.
Thank you all. Thank you. Very powerful responses when you talk about transformation and when you talk about accountability. I think Benita's response as it relates to law enforcement in schools, and Dean Detlef's response in terms of thinking about really restructuring or reorganizing the hiring process really and the admissions process. As all of you were talking, one of the things that I thought um, is this is anti-racist discrimination, and I think another way to say this is disrupting whiteness, right? Disrupting normative ways of doing things that people just accept. And I think you hear a lot, this is the way we do it. And I think what all of you demonstrated in your answers so eloquently is how if we really want to disrupt racism, then we also have to be willing to name and disrupt whiteness. And I think you all gave some really wonderful examples of how that can happen. I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague, Dr. DeMarco, for our next question.
Travis, thank you so much for that wonderful summarizing of all that we've been hearing. I thank you all so much. A couple of you had referred to centering voices of color. And so that is really what our next question is addressing. So to Rebecca and then to Jackie, what are the strategies that you all use in your work, in your organizations to center voices of people of color? So to use those counter narratives, and how do you center those over and against those dominant narratives or those dominant voices that Travis just mentioned?
Yeah, this one comes with a lot of history in the domestic violence movement, because there was like an intentional point in time in which white feminists decided that they were going to go for the win at the expense of people who are marginalized, and go towards moving from grassroots organizations to more professionalized nonprofit organizations with governmental funding that had really, really strong ties to the prison industrial complex. And that was counter to a lot of the Black women leaders, the womanist leaders, who were also leading the movement at the time. And that's something that has shown up in a lot of our organizations moving forward, throughout the domestic and sexual violence movements. And so I think this is one of those spaces where what we see now is that a lot of the folks who are working in our organizations are white cisgender women. And that definitely impacts our ability to actually center voices of color. And so I think this speaks to some of what Derek was saying. Some of what we need to be doing is, like, first of all, learning what the other narratives are and bringing folks to the table and making our organizations safe spaces for folks of color to want to work there. And those are some of those first steps that we're struggling with. I've been on some calls with preventionists across the country, and what we were called out on by a woman of color in that space was that most of us were white women, and we were talking about doing all of these anti-racist things without actually having the voices at the table. And so I think the first thing that we need to do is get the voices at the table so that we have those narratives present. Really do some work to look at what narratives are the dominant narratives that have been established as the status quo that we haven't actually been questioning, that we've been complicit in and have sort of let continue to happen because it's just the way that we've always done things. Yeah, and then like actually be willing to call those things out, get really real with where we're seeing those things show up, both in ourselves and in our organizations and in our movement broadly, and start to actually build relationships, build rapport, build trust with folks who have created their own organizations because our mainstream domestic violence organizations don't feel safe. And learn what are the things about our organizations that aren't feeling safe? How can we do the reimagining that Derek was talking about? How can we recenter around the folks who experience the most marginalization? Because ultimately, if we are serving those folks, then we are going to be serving everybody well. So there's a lot of work to do in this area.
Thanks, Rebecca. Jackie?
So I think having an organization that was founded by primarily white people, and definitely has depended on, in an area that has the largest income disparity in the state, where we really see that though we have a generous community, most people who are thriving here are white. And so that's where IFC gets most of our donations of money and goods, and also volunteerism. So just looking at, I think the counter narrative being not that I'm here to give you something because I have it and you don't, and maybe you did something or not to make that be your reality. But really saying that we're all part of a community, and different people can play different roles in the organization at different times. Sometimes people need things, sometimes people have things to give, and for sure we need to do better about making sure that people of color are at the table to make important decisions, that they're on our board, that they're in our organization in leadership positions, and not just the people who are working at the shelter and the lowest paid folks in the organization, and that we're not tokenizing people, and we're able to support folks to be in those leadership positions, and to also be in leadership positions throughout the community. So to get on boards and commissions, and to make sure that we are really living out our belief that the people experiencing the problem know how to best solve it. And often the root of that is we need to just really dismantle our systems. I would also say we've done our hiring process has changed. We do all of our hiring by committee with different stakeholders involved, including members and residents, and making sure we have as much diversity on those panels as we can. We took education completely off of our job requirements. We banned the box. So we're not asking people coming in if they have a criminal background, and we're not making decisions based on that to screen folks out. And as we bring people into leadership positions and folks grow within the organization, that we're trusting them and they're leading us. People of color are leading meetings, or committees, or and helping white folks who are working here and volunteering here learn what we are doing that we don't even know. I mean, we don't know what we don't know, and we can't rely on people of color to tell us what we don't know, but when they tell us, we need to be listening, and we need to be doing our own work. And so I think that is, first and foremost, something that I've learned is that I have to be doing my own work. I can't depend on other people to tell me what it is that I need to be helping the organization to do. I need to figure that out. And I think just continuing to grow our new project, Activate IFC, is all about civic engagement and leadership development. Leah's been involved in helping that grow. And I think that needs to be funded, it needs to be held up, and it needs to be a big part of the organization and what we're doing. And we need to have our members and residents sitting on policy bodies throughout the community and really making important decisions that impact them. So those are a few thoughts.
Thank you, Jackie. And so I just want to follow up on kind of a thread that I heard in Rebecca, and both Rebecca and Jackie's response, and also just build off something in the comments section. This whole notion of having representative voices at the table, right? And there are a couple of different ways, people think about that in different ways. So if you have a committee of 10 folks and we have, 3 Black folk at the table, then we have, we brought people to the table. But is that really what it means? Because you can have folks sitting at a table who really don't feel like they have any real say or input in terms of organizational structure. So I'm wondering if one of the panelists could just take a moment and speak to what does it really mean to have representative voices at the table in meaningful kinds of ways?
So thank you, Mr. Travis. I think part of the thing that we may want to consider is how does our actual field of social work, how do we as social work professionals show up in communities? We are here on this panel now because we have our degree, not because we are an expert in our field, not because we have the lived experience, not because we know how to best organize anything, not because we know what communities and families and individuals need. We're on this panel because we had access to higher education. And so when we think about the community organizers, the grassroots organizers, the elders in the community, the people who sit down at kitchen tables in the neighborhoods that we would never walk down the street, we need to think about how we, what is the word? They lost, supposedly, lost something because we entered into their space. If we come into a community and say that we are the authority, if we come into the community and say, well, you need to do what I say because I have my degree and so I know better, that is also a disruption, it's an oppression, it is acting out of a space of supposed white supremacy. It is acting through a lot of things that we don't think about because we have our degree. And so our degree says that we have authority to go in and relocate the heads of communities. And so we need to think about that. And that did not actually answer your question, and I apologize. But as a field and as a profession, we have also created a lot of imbalance in communities. We've taken power away from communities. We've created cycles of oppression for communities. And I don't know what it looks like that even if we are in that position of supposed power, sometimes you choose the person that you know is not going to disrupt. Sometimes you choose the person that you know is beholden to a different system. Sometimes you choose a person that is going to push for your agenda and be your spokesperson for the community. So yeah, I think that even deeper than that of who's at the table, we need to think about why is there a table that we're choosing who's coming to it?
Thank you. No, and I do think you answered my question. You gave a very in-depth response when you think about who in a community is recognized as a leader, right? Who has a knowledge about the population and the people that you are really there to serve and support, who can offer wisdom and knowledge and input that is often overlooked or dismissed as irrelevant. So no, I think that your point is very well made and that you answered the question very thoroughly. So thank you. I want to just follow up on that question as well. As we think about seats at the table and knowledge and what knowledge we value and what knowledge we don't value. If you were speaking to a beginning social worker, someone really new to the field and just starting, what advice would you offer about how to recognize and disrupt racism within institutions and organizations? And I say beginning social worker, but I think that some seasoned social workers probably need to hear this advice as well. And so Leah, we want to start and direct that question to you.
Thank you. I think kind of to dovetail from what Benita was speaking about, which is so important, this is an academic conversation that we're having on this panel by design. It's put on by the school. I'm grateful to have my degree. But what I often say and would say is not often academically praised is get in touch with your gut. I think that a lot of these conversations can run the risk of it's all too complicated, we don't understand these systems, every person is different. And I think that people new to the field often tend to have a closer relationship with their gut. Not always, but entering the field for a reason and trusting. I know I keep saying gut, but I hope you know what I'm saying. Really, when you know something is wrong, you might not need an academic explanation to point it out, and trust that, validate that in yourself, in clients, in communities. Some of this is incredibly nuanced and complicated, and some of it's just not that complicated. I mean, Derek is pointing out the data that really speaks volumes, and when we have access to that, I think I'm very disheartened when I see people lose touch with their gut and adopt these lofty lexicons with which to, and man, I do that too, but bringing it back to the gut, which is not maybe an exciting answer. I would also say for folks, when we are nervous, slowing down. I think that white urgency and this fix-it mentality is very prevalent in social work. But when things are hard, slow down. When you don't know an answer, that's okay. Focusing on the stick with itness, which sounds simple, but often in these budding positions of power, the risk to try and prove ourselves will certainly backfire almost every time. And I think resisting that is also resisting a seductive power that can make us worse for the clients and communities that we aim to serve, or the research that we aim to do, or the systems that we hope to disrupt. And going in, I have been learning and would encourage others to not make lofty promises. While goals are very important, I think that people can quickly become out of integrity with their word, with our word, with my word. I can become out of integrity with my word if I am new to the scene and I know exactly what I'm going to do. I need to be careful with my word, and I would offer that advice to others as well. So I think that's what I would have to say now. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. We want to make sure that we get to some of the questions from our audience. And so I'm going to just ask the last of our prepared questions. And I'm going to direct this question to Dean Detlef. And we've had what I think is a very important conversation about practice and how to disrupt racism in practice. And I just want to end the prepared questions by asking, is it even possible for the practice of social work to be disruptive when you consider how social work is so embedded within the context of institutions, and it has often maintained systems of oppression that we see in our society? Is it even possible for us to think that social work can be disruptive?
Yeah, I think this is such an important question, particularly for those of us who are in academia to be thinking about. So, is it possible? I think it needs to be. We need to make it possible, and I think those conversations are starting to happen now. But as you alluded to, the reality is we teach people how to practice social work, and then we send them to work in racist institutions without preparing them for that. So we're not preparing students to be disruptive. We're not preparing them, in many cases, to address the racism that they're going to experience in the systems that they go to work in, or even talk about the fact that these systems are racist, the racist origins of these systems, the racist outcomes that they produce. So this starts by, again, this has been brought up for, but examining our history, and not just the history of racism in this country, but the history of racism in our profession is something that I don't think we do a very good job of as educational institutions of teaching our students about. How many of our programs are really teaching our students about the fact that in the very early days of our profession in the settlement house movement, Black children and families were intentionally excluded from that movement by the leaders of the settlement house movement? How many of our schools of social work are talking about Jane Addams, who's often kind of looked at one of the founders of our profession? Jane Addams very eloquently, in some ways, spoke out early against lynchings, but she also, in the same letter that she wrote coming out against lynchings, called Black men bestial and implicitly justified those lynchings. Those are the kind of racist origins of our profession that we really need to be educating our students about, to know where we started and then how decades of policy development have led to the systems that we now occupy space in that continue to produce racist outcomes. But I think we need to take that further. Disrupting racism for me is really about disrupting systems. And I think we need to be talking more about our role as social workers in supporting these systems that we work in. I've talked a lot about my views about policing. I don't think it's okay that we as social workers to continue to cooperate in what we know is a harmful and racist institution. I think that social work as a profession needs to completely discontinue our relationships with law enforcement. And I think we also really need to look at our relationship with what people call the Child Protective Services system, but is really the family punishment system. Systems that we know cause harm to Black and Brown people. I think we really need to start rethinking our involvement in those systems. And then taking it further to not just talk about our cooperation with these systems, but I think we really need to be talking more about abolition of these systems. I think that the work of social work needs to become the work of abolition, because we've been involved in these systems for decades. And we've tried to reform these systems for decades, and it isn't working. And it isn't working for all of the things we've talked about, because these systems the racism is so entrenched in these systems. Reforms aren't going to do that. So I think we really need to start rethinking why these systems exist and work towards ending these systems. I know that abolition is a scary idea for a lot of people. 6 months ago, it was a fringe idea for many people. I think it's much more in the public discourse right now. But I think as social work educators, we really need to be unpacking and exploring what abolition means with our students, because abolition isn't about ending systems. Abolition is about creating new ways of responding to the challenges that we face in society. Abolition, when we think of abolishing the prison industrial complex, this isn't just about having no place for murderers and serial killers to go. It's about asking ourselves, why are there so many murderers and serial killers in our society to begin with? And what can we do to address that? When we think about abolishing the Child Protective Services system, it isn't about thinking about, well, what's going to happen to all the kids that are abused? It's about asking ourselves, why are there so many children in our society that are abused in the first place? And what can we do to address that? And that's our role as social workers. That should be the world that we're trying to create. But I think that many of us are still afraid to be having those conversations. And that's where I think we really need to lean into. Abolition is social work. And I think we really need to start focusing more on that.
Thank you so much for your response. And I want to just pause and thank all of the panelists for your responses for this portion of our prepared questions. We now want to turn to the question and answer portion of this webinar and make sure that we entertain some of the questions for our audience. And so Allison is going to, has curated a few of the questions that have come in, and she's going to start us with this section.
Thanks, Travis. So I wanted to pull in two that I thought would be a little bit speedier to answer, because there's some really deep questions that I want us to dig into. But first, I think Rebecca, you talked about caucusing. So we had a question about, can you please share about race-based caucusing? How is that operationalized and the benefits of having this within an organization?
Sure. So this was initially introduced to us when we were working directly with the equity consultant. But this process basically provides spaces for folks to separate by their racial identity in order to do the work that is necessary from those different groups. So as a white person, it's my job to do a lot of work to educate myself and to do some unlearning of white supremacy that has been embedded in everything about who I was or who I am and who I was brought up to be from the beginning. And to do a lot of work together in ways that don't burden our colleagues of color with our own emotional reactions and our own defensiveness that happen. And then the folks of color have, the way that we have it in our agency is we have 3 different caucuses. We have white folks, we have Black folks, and we have non-Black folks of color who have named themselves the Brown Caucus. And so the way that the People of Color caucuses work is that this is a place of support. This is a place to build collective power within the organization and to be able to organize together to then be able to make their voices more heard within the organization. And then we have also used these caucuses as a way for the folks of color caucuses to call out the white people caucus. And so we have sort of used our caucusing as a method for accountability as well. So there have been instances in which the other caucuses have come to the white caucus to say like, hey, this thing happened, like y'all need to address this. And so like, then we're able to take that to the white caucus space and really talk about what went wrong, why that happened, and what can we do to do better in the future. And then if there were some additional requests for resolution, we can kind of address those as they arise. We've also used the white caucus space as ways to use our white people voices on behalf of folks of color when we've been asked to do advocacy with folks who have more power. So those are more folks who have more power in our agency, our board, in a couple of other different ways. So they've worked in a couple of different ways for us. And there's a lot of literature out there on how to do caucusing and how to begin those spaces. But I have found them to be really helpful for my own learning and for being able to understand what accountability looks like when we're doing anti-racism in our organizations, and to really sharpen our skills and flex our muscles so that we can continue to act in anti-racist ways within our organization and challenge the ways that white supremacy is showing up.
Thanks, Rebecca. So one other question that came up earlier that the UNC School of Social Work is doing this now too, and Dean Detlef, you mentioned this. What are you using instead of a GRE for your graduate program?
We're not. I mean, it's not about replacing it with anything. It's about recognizing it that it's a racist measure and getting rid of it as part of what we factor into what we're looking for in terms of admissions. So we're really looking at the skills, the experiences that people bring with them. For us, we're really looking for how they connect to our social racial justice mission. We want students to explain why they want to come to our program and how they want to use their education to achieve social, racial, economic, and political justice. So it's looking more at what they want to use with their social work education and the values and skills that they bring with them to do that. It's not about replacing one measure with another measure.
Thanks so much. Sarah, do you have a question you want us to dig into?
We don't have anything on YouTube. All the questions are so excellent. So here's a question. Does the panel have any thoughts regarding the practice of code switching? If so, should social work practitioners actively dismiss this as an approach to engaging people from diverse communities? Or can this be viewed as another practice in disrupting racist practices at the micro level? And if you didn't get all that, panelists, you can peek at the Q&A.
Yes, let's let the Black person answer that question. What was it again about code switching and should we what?
Let's see, Allison, can you help me like rephrase that?
Sure.
You said social workers tell children not to code switch?
No, it just talks about the practice of code switching. And so should we actively dismiss this as an approach to engaging people from diverse cultures? So I guess maybe let's have a conversation about code switching. How about that? And open it up to see if anyone wants to just to respond to that as a concept or practice or.
Because that doesn't even feel right for somebody else to tell a person of color when and when they cannot code switch, just off top. And I code switch every day, code switching right now. It is part of who we are. I feel like everybody code switches because at the end of the day, the things that you say at home, you don't say at work. Just our outcomes, data, and everything that we do would show that if we always practice and behave and operate in the way that we say, we wouldn't have these inequities. So
thank you.
Really, yeah, it doesn't feel right. I don't know if that is a, yeah, I'm gonna be quiet about that question.
Don't be quiet, don't be quiet. And, you know, I think I had this conversation yesterday when we talk about this notion of code switching. And as you mentioned, you know, again, and I often talk about sometimes in settings, we have to come to speak the King's English, right? But who define what the King's English is? And so often I get told, particularly by white people, well, I like the way you articulate yourself. So what do you really mean, right? What is the value and belief you have for people of color if you have to verbalize to a person of color that they articulate themselves very well, right? And so when you use words and terms, even though you may think it's endearing or it's a compliment, but you don't know what it's doing to people of color. The other side of that is when we're with other people of color, we sometimes use language and lingo that we feel comfortable with, but it's also about survival. It's about how we have to navigate different systems and environments just to survive. And I'm not saying it's right or wrong is what it is. It's around cultural conditioning, how the systems have conditioned us. And we have to navigate in a way to survive inside the system, but at the same time, adapt outside. And I think it's challenging. And that's why one of the things I really believe is that allowing people, diversity and inclusion is about really valuing and respecting people's voice and perspective, regardless of where they're from. It's not giving them advice on what they should do and how they should do it, right? It's about letting Derek Anderson, well, let me repeat that. Derek Anderson would show up in a place and space how he choose to, right? And I would lead with my authentic voice and my lived experience and my vulnerability. And so the question is, if someone has a concern with that, is the problem with me or is the problem with that person? So sometimes we don't do our own self-examination when we begin to critique other people based on how they show up, rather than looking at, and we know I told you about actions and behavior, values and beliefs, your socialization. So when we think about our socialization and how we show up, what value system are we now using to assess people and make recommendations and judgments and those biases? And so if we don't understand how that's rooted sometime in white supremacy, how that's rooted in this whole notion that the ideas and thoughts and beliefs are white or superior to others. That's part of the culture. And then how we see it and how we name it and recognize it is something different. I think that's more individualized based on the person than based on other things.
Thank you. Here's maybe a quick question. Do you think that we should rethink the title of social worker?
I'll say quickly, I don't know that it's so much about the title social worker. I think it's about acknowledging the damage and the harm that we as social workers have caused to individuals and families throughout our history, and doing the work that's necessary to start to repair or heal some of that damage. You know, the name comes with baggage, but it's changing the name isn't going to fix the problem. It's changing the root causes of the harm that we as social workers have caused people that we really need to think more about.
And I
Thank
think
you.
asking people to like accept symbolic change. So even when we go and change the names on these buildings, we take down these statues. Okay, so then what happens next? And so there's a lot to be done with the field and profession of social work before we look at the name. I don't call myself a social worker. I have a social work degree, but I don't refer to myself as a social worker. That's a label that other people put on me.
Thank you both for those responses. I want to kind of turn our attention just a little bit more. When we think about the institutions that we work in, so oftentimes we work in institutions that sometimes are embedded within other institutions, or we work in specific areas that are embedded in larger structures. And so the question that comes from Anna is, how does a program or smaller unit wanting to do the work to address racism or white supremacy culture, how does that happen when you exist in a much larger system, for example, a university setting or larger nonprofit organization, and don't have buy-in from top to bottom, or from bottom to top?
One of the things, part of our role again with Race Matters, we're system organizers, which means that we work with system leaders, and system leaders haven't bought in, haven't been able to want to be on the journey, then it's challenging. And so we look at how do we influence system leaders to then look at, a part of our process is working with system leaders, and then we have racial equity workshops that they participate in. And so that starts the journey. And then they work through their leadership team all the way down to include people as a part of that process. And then we have other strategies and processes in place to continue to deepen our analysis and understanding about race, racism, institutional racism, implicit bias. When you talked about the affinity groups, we also have affinity groups for people of color, whites, and we do join. It's a place where people can continue to learn and unlearn, but also the shared learning that comes along with it as a way of developing the tools and skills to advancing racial equity. One of the things we talk about is culture. Culture is hard to change and shift, even when policies and procedures change. And if you say, Derek, how does that happen? If you go and talk about discrimination policies, and if you go in this to your HR department, just aggregate the data and say, are people still being discriminated by race and by gender? And the question is yes, then how does that happen if you have a policy that impacts that, right? And so we talk about culture and we talk about influence. And so if you have leadership who has developed a culture there that can be punitive, and then it's also then prevents the opportunity to change. You know what I mentioned earlier, sometimes it's the intellectual exercise where we say we should do things, but then the hearts and minds and action behavior doesn't line up with it. We talk about those that are transactional versus transformational. And so I think it's an intentional process where we have to center equity and be intentional about interrupting systems and structures. And there has to be feedback and a system of accountability that's included in that mix in order to do so. Otherwise, the systems are designed to do what they do. Then you'll find a way to continue to marginalize people who are speaking out, to either consequent them or label them, or they're not able to fast track to be in leadership or management. So the culture has a way of addressing people who are reacting to address those systems. And so sometimes if system leaders are not engaged, if system leaders are not on board, it's really hard to make a pivot or hard to make a shift to move this work inside those systems and structures. But it also takes education. it also takes the heart and mind, and it connects a connected spirit, a collective will to want to do it and be able to be intentional and transparent about the process and who's engaged in the process, and making sure that diverse voices and perspectives are at the table at the front end, and not that the plan's designed and then you invite people to participate. Because that also has an impact on those who feel like this is just a transactional, or I don't feel like my voice and perspective is a part of the process. And that has to do with culture as well.
Thanks, Derek. Sorry, Travis. We just have a few more minutes. So there's one question in here that's kind of like, what's our charge going forward? So maybe if we could, every panelist, and we'll start with Leah, and kind of just go around, what is your charge for us? What do you challenge us to do?
I think I would start with, forgive me, but I think a lot of us know the places that we're afraid to do the work. And so while this is hyper specific for who asked this question or for who's watching this, do the thing you're afraid to do that is challenging racism within your organization. Maybe it's your conversation with your boss. Maybe it's a funder you're worried about losing. My charge to all of us would be that thing that you know you need to try, but you're scared to do it.
Thanks, Leah. Rebecca?
A lot of what I was just thinking was what Leah was just saying, but like white folks in particular, like do the work and like do your own internal work, do the work of flexing the muscles of calling things out when you see them, and like be courageous. We have privilege that we're able to use towards dismantling the system that gives us that privilege. And so like, just, yeah, doing the work and being courageous, as Leah was saying.
Thanks, Rebecca. Alan?
I would say for all of the organizations, institutions, schools of social work that are now doing all of these great anti-racist initiatives, ask yourselves why you weren't doing those things 6 months ago, and then try to address that. Why weren't you doing those things 6 months ago, and figure out the problems in your organizations and institutions that created that.
Thanks, Alan. Jackie?
I would say be humble, especially white people. Listen to what people are telling you. Surround yourself with people who are not going to tell you, or who are going to tell you things that you don't want to hear. And those people that Derek were talking about who would not be, management potential, or those are the people who need to be elevated within organizations and put in places of power so that change can really happen and culture can start changing. And I think for organizations doing this work, we need to figure out how to better work together so that we can really disrupt the bigger systems. I think there's a lot of great things happening within organizations, but people are looking for what's next. And I think we need to tackle those big things as collaborations and not be siloed or competing with each other.
Thanks, Jackie. Benita?
Hi. As far as the educational system is concerned, I think that I would like for us to think about that we create what we see in the future. Like, we play a part, we play a huge role in so many things that we don't consider day to day, because we're looking at test scores, we're looking at very minute details and things that we have to do. But if we think collectively about the 12 years that we had socializing people that made them think it was okay to put their knee on somebody's neck, that made them think it was okay to hunt somebody down because you look like you don't belong here, to stand in front of people's apartments and say, you need to show me proof that you aren't here to create harm. If we think about, as an educational system, how we build that person and build that collective, I think that we would change a lot of things about the way that we operate. We build great people, we build great spaces, but we also contribute to the harm that people do to others. We also contribute to harmful spaces and harmful ways of thinking, and putting the onus on the students of color and the staff of color and the parents of color to make things look good, make our data look good. We need to also look at how we're socializing people.
Thanks, Benita. And Derek?
I guess for me, one of the things about this work for me, this work is regardless of this work is personal and professional. I don't turn it on and turn it off, right? And so to recognize that I can sit on this platform here and I can still be impacted just like any other Black male. Me, my brothers, my son, my friends, my wife, my daughter. And that's something we have to live with constantly. We don't have an option or a choice. It's not about what we have attained. And so the other side of that is, I also believe that I am the problem and the solution, which means I have to be willing to shift my mental model about how I see people and how I serve people, according to one of our co-founders. The other thing is we have to look at our shifting our values and beliefs and our action and behaviors and how we see people, period, right? And that starts with us. And as we talked about, we're individuals who work inside of systems and institutions. So if we're not willing to change ourselves, then how do we expect to change inside of those systems and institutions? So the work starts with us. And we also have to be willing to call out and call in people who are not willing to adapt and adjust. That's part of the process. And I think that's part of the individual work that each of us have a social and moral obligation to do. And I call the distraction is that when I hear people saying what other people need to do to change, but they're not willing to change. They're not willing to do their heart work, right? This work is around the heart and mind. The other side of that within systems and institutions, we must disaggregate our data by race and gender. And if we did that, started from the top all the way down, and then having a very real intentional conversation. So we have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. We have to sit with our growing edge. We have to be a curious learner of this. And this works is around relationships. Getting connected to one-on-one, understanding the story and lived experiences of people is the very first step. Because what I find out in this work, and I've been doing this work a long time, is that we have more in common than we have difference. And if we're not willing to sit and understand the story and lived experience and acknowledge the harm, and at the same time, as clinicians, we have to be mindful not to continue to cause harm, intentionally and unintentionally as we move forward, even as clinicians of color in this work. And so I think as a part of that process, of the part of this journey, it's not a check the box. It's not a one and done. This is an organized, intentional effort that happens every day, and we have to be intentional around it. I stay in self-reflection, which means I'll wake up tomorrow to reflect on, hopefully today I didn't cause any harm, unintentional to anybody. And if I did, what did I learn from it? And what is it I can better tomorrow to not cause harm to anybody, regardless of their race or gender? And that's a practice. When we talk about social work practice, we have to understand that social work professors not all have the tools and skills and knowledge to understand how to have this discussion and conversation. The other thing we have to recognize is that this is not part, we should embed this as part of the curriculum across the profession. It should be mandatory and not just taught one semester, it should be taught every semester. It has to be part of culture. It has to be intentional, but you need people who have the tools and skills in order to be in front and teaching as a part of that. And I think as I close, we just have to look at how we can be better to each other. We have to stop being mean to each other. We have to look at how do we give people the benefit of the doubt, even when our bias and everything inside of us don't, just like we want people the benefit of the doubt. And so the change starts with us. And then we have to be intentional about every system that we volunteer in or that we work in. We have to be intentional to engage and work with others to look at those policy, procedure, and practice through a racial equity lens and be able to address it.
Well, thank you so much on behalf of Allison, Travis, myself, our School of Social Work. Deepest heartfelt gratitude to all of our panelists tonight. There are so many drop the mic moments. I'm trying to live tweet this. It's a new skill. I'd like to shout out Madison Ferrara, my graduate student, who is trying to help us do this. I mean, so many amazing points made. We are very grateful to you. Everyone, we do have an evaluation that we'll be sending out because we need feedback loops. One lesson I learned tonight. So we hope you'll respond to that. We will be posting this recording on the website, the Jordan Institute for Families.org website. And we want to continue this conversation so that we can continue to make change happen. And also look for your t-shirt that says abolition is social work. Thank you all so much. We hope you have a good night, and we will be in conversation again with you soon. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
That was fabulous.
Thanks.
Thank you. We had a lot of people join us this evening, y'all.
Just FYI, I know that people are getting off, but I think folks can still hear.
They can.
Yes,
Yeah,
they can.
okay.
My very first MSW intern that I supervised said she took 3 pages of notes.
I hope I got everything right on Twitter. I was typing as fast as I can.
Yeah, I was texting a friend, and I just texted the fire symbol, and the friend was like, "Oh my goodness, I just got off. What did I miss?" And I was like, "Okay, so I gave him 2 quotes. The first one was I gave him, Derek, this work is personal. I don't turn it off and on." When Derek said that, I just wanted to sit here and wave my hand, but I was like, I'm on a webinar, I can't do that. And the second one, Alan, if you just started your diversity work in the past 6 months, you need to ask yourself why. I was like, whew, that was everything. So I really appreciate you all and the honesty and the depth of conversation. I think we could have gone another hour and we still wouldn't have done everything that we needed to do. And so I just want to say that I appreciate you all coming on and being a part of this conversation. It was really awesome.
Thank you all for holding this. I was so excited to see this coming out of the School of Social Work. So yeah, thanks for creating these spaces.
Thanks for inviting me here to this space. It was nice to meet you all.
Yeah, it was so good to see you in your face and not just hearing people or seeing them on email these days.
And I appreciate the invite as well.
Sure.
It's truly an honor anytime I have an opportunity to be in fellowship and platform with other colleagues in the work. I greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you all for your time. This is the 3rd installment, if you will, that we have co-sponsored together. We did one this summer around policing, and then our first webinar that we worked on together was around COVID-19 and racial disparities. And we have gotten such a good response that we are going to continue to do this. I think that people are really interested. I think people want these conversations. I think that they have been wanting these conversations for a long time. And so, Rebecca, I understand exactly what you were saying when you made your last comment. And I just want to say that this is something that I think Sarah and Allison would agree. We're not slowing down. We're actually just getting started.
Awesome.
That makes me excited.
Absolutely.
That's good, because one of the things that we find is that because I'm sure as many of you all, we host and part of a lot of platforms, and you have two mindsets. One mindset is people just enjoy having a conversation, right? The other part is the action. What happens thereafter, and how do you have both and? How do you continue to have those engaging conversations, but also there are some intentional transformational action steps that are happening to move forward. And so one of the things that I'm part of the NESW chapter here. And one of the things that we have organized as a racial equity group to really look at how we can really organize and mobilize social workers to really impact within the profession. And how we can really not just have these conversations, but be intentional about engaging those voices who have been missing. What are the other gaps in perspective that are not at the table? It's not always black and white, right? And so really broadening that conversation to a full scope of the essence of what social work in the profession really is supposed to be about, and being intentional about as we moving forward to impact systems and institutions through a racial equity lens. And one of the greatest opportunities really get to know each other, building those bonds and relationships as part of the journey in the process. I think is what I find that sustains it most. So again, I thank you all for having this audience, and thank you all for allowing my voice to be in the space.
Thanks, Derek.
Yeah, thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks,
And
everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Can I ask, maybe follow up when we're off live, but in the spirit of beyond conversation, and I was interested, one of the questions that didn't get answered was about critical race theory making its way into social work. And that was one of the classes and types of study I was most grateful for in graduate school, but sadly had to take it outside of the School of Social Work. So I'm really interested in if there's more rumblings about how to do that, and how, of course, to do it with philosophical integrity, right? Because it's not born out of the profession. So maybe online or offline, I would love to hear more about developments there, if there are rumblings or what's up there.
Thanks.
So-
I almost turned that over to Travis.
But I first I'm gonna say, and I know we are still live and I'm saying this, that I learned about critical race theory from you, Leah. Thank you. I teach it now and I use it now all the time.
So Leah, I don't mind. We are still live, but I'm not gonna say anything that would stop me. That I think is.
It did stop the recording.
Okay. So, but one of the things that we have done, so 501 is our Confronting Oppression and Institutional Discrimination course. So one of the things, so for folks who may not know,